His arms were raised high over his head in the gesture that soon became his trademark. A variation of this, two arms aloft with two fingers held up in victory symbols, would become a Nixon trademark too. Years later, even after all that happened between them, even though Eisenhower frequently made his life miserable, Nixon still saw him as a large historical figure, distant and even unapproachable despite his startlingly friendly smile. When Nixon talked about him to crowds and reporters, his language could veer toward reverence. In moments of ecstatic campaigning, he might refer to him as a man singled out by destiny, the heroic figure of that victory parade. But as Nixon got to know Eisenhower, he came to see a different man. Someone who could radiate kindness and bonhomie while acting with cold indifference and even casual cruelty. And someone comfortable with issues of war and peace, but far less so when it came to the problems of his own country and the politics of Washington. On a personal level, Nixon's early relationship with Eisenhower, who was old enough to be his father, had a filial aspect, though one without much filial affection. He saw the president as someone who rarely appreciated his contributions, and as someone used to rapid, absolute obedience. During his 8 years as vice president, he often felt like a junior officer coming in to see the commanding general, and sometimes a junior officer who had to endure rebukes and snubs, some of them more imagined than real. The journalist and Nixon confidant Ralph de Toledano told a friend, "There were times when I would find Nixon literally close to tears after a session at the White House, during which Eisenhower humiliated Nixon." Nixon, though, was an attentive pupil. He observed Eisenhower's responses to international crises and domestic emergencies, and saw the value of an orderly hierarchical White House, the importance of gestures, and the virtues of patience. Some of these lessons would fade, but Nixon absorbed them with the steady focus of an A student, eager to play a larger role in the eyes of a superior who regarded him as a bright synthesizer, rather than as a proponent of imaginative views. Eisenhower did not have a high regard for professional politicians, but he valued Nixon's logical mind and his expressions of loyalty. And after a time he listened to his opinions on questions ranging from civilian control of space to civil rights. It was understood that Nixon, as a veteran Red Hunter, helped to protect Eisenhower from the resentful Republican right. Eisenhower returned the favor by giving Nixon an increasingly useful veil of moderation. Neither man regarded this as a partnership. Vice presidents since the time of John Adams traditionally filled a distinctly peripheral role. But by accident as well as design, their association, in and out of office, grew, and that helped to shape the ideology, foreign policy, and domestic goals of the 20th century. When Eisenhower ran for president in 1952, he was an elderly 62. The war had worn him down. Years of heavy smoking, too much coffee, and non-stop stress. When he selected the 39-year-old Nixon as his running mate, he relied on his advisers, most of whom he didn't know well, and who hadn't come up with many choices. In any case, he wasn't personally acquainted with the potential field. Apart from an occasional stateside visit, he'd been away from America, in Panama as a young officer, in the Philippines as an aide to General Douglas MacArthur, in North Africa and Europe during the war, a lot more than he'd been at home. He had met Nixon only twice, and briefly, at a Bohemian Grove summer retreat in the summer of 1950, and in Paris in the spring of 1951, when he was at SHAPE, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe. He was aware of all the anti-communist excitement in the States in which Nixon had played a significant part, but he never recorded an impression of Nixon himself. On the surface, the two men could not have been less alike. Nixon was a talented speaker, but he often seemed miserable in his political appearances. The journalist Russell Baker saw him as a painfully lonesome man undergoing an ordeal, and sympathized with his discomfort with the obligatory routines of his chosen profession. As a public man, he knew that he was unloved, and sometimes spoke of the pain that cartoonists inflict.